Okay, so last part, the slave trade, which is yet another reason why England becomes so powerful in this Atlantic economy. So realize that the slave trade is proliferating because land in the British Americas is cheap and it's readily available, much unlike land in the British Isles, all right? So that's one of the reasons why you have so much colonial development in the 18th century, all right? Mercantile policies also are going to create a greater demand for labor because, of course, they want to maximize exports and to minimize imports. So the more things that you could produce in the British colonies, the greater England's economy will be in turn. So, one of the best ways to produce as many products as possible for the least amount of money as possible is to use free labor to do so. So this is one of the other reasons why there's such an increasing reliance on slavery. We get to the point where African slaves are actually going to outnumber whites in the Caribbean colonies. Okay, partly because the sugar industry is so prominent in the British Indies. All right. Also, in the North American South, you're going to see that African slaves are going to make up approximately 20% of the population. So even though there are far more slaves per capita in the Caribbean, we still have a pretty substantial slave population in North America. All right, so of course, because of the increasing use of slave labor, we're also going to have a dramatic growth in the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, so by the time the 17th and 18th centuries roll around, we've had about 10 million Africans transported from Africa to the New World. This is also significant, and it shows you England's predominance because half of those 10 million were transported on British ships. The other half, 25% were on French ships, and then the rest were on Dutch, Portuguese, Danish, and American ships. All right, and so how does the slave trade ultimately work? Well, on the West African coast, we have these forts, or also they're referred to as factories. And they're set up on the West African coast, and they oversee and protect the slave trade. All right, they're kind of like holding pens for the slaves before they're loaded onto the ships. They're also, because of that reason, seen as the gate of no return for slaves. Once they end up in these forts, they're the only thing that's going to end up happening to them is that they're going to be placed on a slave ship and sent across the Atlantic. The other interesting thing is that most slaves actually were captured by rival African tribes, and they traded slaves for European goods such as cloth, alcohol, weapons. So, so you actually have some Africans initiating and proliferating the slave trade. All right, many slaves that were captured in the African interior actually die before they even reach the slave forts on the West African coast. All right, and this is due to these forced marches from the interior to the West African coast. But it's important to realize that many slaves actually were not from the coast itself, but from farther inland. And this is also because of the increasing demand for slaves. Eventually, there really isn't a slave population on the coast, so they have to go further and further into Africa. So we can see why this has such a significant effect on African society and how we can talk about how that leads to the kind of scramble for Africa in the period of colonialization later in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But we'll get there later. So, so after they actually make it onto the ships, conditions are not necessarily better. We have the journey across the Atlantic is referred to as the Middle Passage. And in this journey, between 20% and one-third of slaves actually die when they're still en route to the New World. All right, and this is because of their conditions. They really are treated as cargo. They are cramped very closely together. It is very unsanitary. They are in the ship's hold. They're not able to kind of get out and have fresh air. Also, many female slaves were raped during this journey, so some of them, if they do survive, they actually arrive in the New World already pregnant. So most slaves at first were taken to Brazil or the West Indies, and that was to work on the sugar plantations. Again, remember how important sugar was to the Atlantic economy, and it's also a very labor-intensive um, industry. So it requires a lot of slaves. Also, you have up to 400,000 slaves ending up in British North America in colonies like Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina. All right, and interestingly, the slave trade itself actually starts to decline by the 1780s or so. It's abolished in the American colonies in 1808. It was a provision in the Constitution. But even though the slave trade declines, we know that in the Americas, slavery is not actually abolished until the mid 19th century. So you might say, well, why did the slave population continue to proliferate even after the slave trade declines? Well, easy, natural increase, right? Which is another way of saying that the slave population is increasing because they are having babies. They don't necessarily have to be imported into the United States. All right, so basically you see that the slave trade continue or that the slave population continues to be very significant even if the slave trade itself declines. Right, last but not least is colonial North America, right? So how or colonial Latin America, that is. So how is Spain kind of developing its own unique colonial culture in the Americas? Right, like we were already saying, the Spanish Empire was struggling for a period of time, all right, when they had these Habsburg leaders, right, ending with Charles II. Um, this was the reason why Spanish absolutism was declining, all right, but interestingly, there is a recovery when Philip of Anjou, or Philip V, remember this French Bourbon, becomes king after the War of Spanish Succession, right? Kind of having fresh blood on the Spanish throne was very, very good for Spain, actually. So one of the things that happens is the navy becomes more powerful, and it becomes the third most powerful navy in the world behind Britain and France. All right. Also, remember that Spain gained some territory from France under the Treaty of Paris. So they get Louisiana territory from France. So this also is one of the reasons why the Spanish presence in the New World is going to be developing pretty well. Also, there is a pretty substantial silver mining industry in these Spanish colonies, and interestingly, half of the world's supply of silver is actually coming from the Spanish colonies. All right, so their silver mining industry is very significant. So what we start to see in colonial Latin America is that there is this kind of new social development. We have these new groups of people that are resulting in the kind of blending of Spanish and American cultures. All right, so the first group of people to be familiar with are the Creoles, and they account for 20% of the population in Latin America. All right, so Creoles are Spaniards, but they're born in Latin America. All right, and they actually they feel like they are kind of their own aristocracy. They kind of want to mimic the European style aristocracy in Latin America. So because of that, they start to rival the power of the Spanish authorities. So they're technically not Spanish because they weren't born there, but because they have Spanish blood and because economically they can be very powerful and influential, they kind of start to resent the Spanish authority that exists in the Spanish colonies. Right, and so one of the things they actually do is they start to exploit the native or indigenous population, and so they impose this system called debt peonage on the indigenous population, which is sort of like a form of serfdom. What it does is it makes it so that Indians are in perpetual debt to the Creole population. So basically, the population has absolutely no kind of independence. They have no ability to to work without completely depending on the Creole population. So you have the Native American population kind of completely in debt to the Creoles. Another population is the Mestizos, and they make up about 30% of the population of Latin America, and they are children that were born to Spanish fathers and Indian mothers. So we actually see that there's more kind of cultural mixing between the Spanish settlers and the native population than there is in the British colonies, right? It's much more rare for the British colonists to actually have children with the indigenous population, right? And then you also have Amerindians, which were just the native population, all right, and they constitute about 70% of the population. So you see, still there's a really substantial native population that exists in the Spanish colonies. But unfortunately, they are the not slaves per se, but they are certainly kind of an enserfed population. They do almost all of the hard labor in the countryside to benefit the landowners or the Creoles. All right. Also, the remaining population is made up of slaves. So you have slaves that reside in the sugar plantations of Cuba and Puerto Rico. All right, and lastly, we have Portuguese Brazil. And again, one of the most important elements of the colonies in Brazil was sugar. We have some substantial sugar population plantations in Brazil, and this requires a massive number of slaves. By the early 19th century, half of Brazil's population was of African descent, and the Portuguese, Indian, and African populations in Brazil actually also intermixed socially to actually even a greater degree than the Spanish Empire. And so the population of Brazil still is much more multiracial than what we have in both Latin America and British America. So that gives you a general sense of what Latin America is looking at during this time, and we also previously saw how the slave trade is proliferating in the 18th century. So it's important to kind of take away from this reading how much England is growing, especially at the expense of France and the Netherlands, but to a certain extent Spain, because England is taking over the slave trade after the War of Spanish Succession. So we'll talk about this stuff more in class, but hopefully this was a good start to what we will talk about.